Welcome to Sharp Shares. This is Sadie Sharp, and this is your weekly video blog talking about everything that makes us who we are as multi-passionate human beings. Now, this week I wanted to get a guest on, a lady called Sarah James Wright. Now, I met Sarah about 3 years ago now, and I had some coaching from Sarah, but to this day, I still struggle to describe exactly what it is that Sarah did, because it was way more than coaching. And to this day, it's still one of the most pivotal experiences I have ever had in my entire life. And I genuinely wouldn't have gone on to do things like write my book, work my way out of my business partnership, and certainly launch my youth project had I not had this experience. So I wanted to get Sarah onto the call today to share some of her insight around what it is that she does, how she helps individuals, but also on scale, if we can take some of those slightly different ways of looking at the world and at ourselves into organisations, what are some of the transformations that could be delivered if we really embrace a different way of working? So welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sadie. It's lovely to be here.
On a Friday nonetheless as well. So, so Sarah,
Happy
as I said,
Friday.
genuinely speaking, when people say, oh, well, you've done so much and how did you get started? And I was thinking about so many different things for such a long time. And I always felt like I was coming up short. I didn't really feel that I had the strength or the confidence or the justification to step into that space until I started working with you. But as I said, I still struggle to explain the process that we went through. I mean, I've had lots of coaching in the past over the years, and I still remember I turned up to my first session with you. I got my pen and my paper out, and I sat down and you said, right, you can put that away. You won't be needing that. And I genuinely thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to find another coach now, aren't I? This is going to be like one of those fluffy sessions. But I swear to God, I feel like a different person now. So can you explain to us in much better terms than I am right now, what is it that you do? And how is it different to maybe what people might experience when they hear the word coaching as such?
Okay, well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And yes, I definitely remember the first day we met and you were talking like a million miles an hour as well about everything. And that's always a big clue for me about where you are on the inside. And lots of people do struggle to explain, what just happened in this kind of coaching. I still struggle to really kind of put it into words. But a lot of people do report that they've had a deeper transformational experience through this way of working. And I think that's because often we go into a project, even if it's about us, around change, and we're pushing to change something about ourselves. So that we're already starting from this kind of mindset that I'm not right as I am, I'm not good enough. And we're still pushing ourselves even harder, which is probably the problem that, at the root of it at the first place. And actually, the behaviors that we have are all driven by the belief systems that we hold and the way we relate to ourselves as a whole human being. So this way, kind of like it works deeper down. So you really go into, it's hard to find the right languaging for this, but I often call it like the ground of our being. And I guess a more accessible analogy might be you can't put new software in if you've got a really old operating system. So it's about sort of upgrading that operating system that can take you to the places that you want to go. And often there's a kind of fulfillment gap between where we sense where we are and what we know we've got inside us. And as you say, we're always kind of looking, how do we bridge that gap? And the traditional way is to kind of push through. It's like, well, we've got to work harder, isn't it? This cult of working hard that we're all kind of subject to. And this way is really different and says, whoa, 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 let's not do that. Let's try something really different. So if we really slow down and start looking at, well, why do we think this way? Why are we in this busyness? What's going on kind of under the surface? We find that we kind of get to this deep well of potential that we knew was there, which is what creates the frustration, we always know there's more to us. And really, I've got a fly in here, by the way. It just keeps zooming past me. So
Keeping it real, Sarah. That's what it is. This is all real.
we'll include the fly. Nature is here today. But yeah, if we kind of dig deeper down, we can get to that well of potential and then bring that out into whatever projects we want it to flow into. And when we do that, we tend to feel more relaxed, calmer, more spacious, less stressed, healthier, more creative, more innovative, more powerful. It's like this whole flow starts to come with that, in a sense, we've been standing on our own hose the whole time. We pinch ourselves off with these expectations that we put on ourselves. So it's a lot about sort of unprogramming ourselves from a lot of cultural, societal norms, especially in organizations, to find that sort of deep well of creativity, passion, innovation I believe it's in all of us. It's always there.
I think it's certainly, even hearing you talk now, I still think of some of the journeys that I was going through at that point in time. And I think it's not until you stop and you slow down and you properly kind of breathe and look at what is in this space, what am I either running from? There were a
Yeah,
lot of things that I was running from that were kind of part of my beliefs about myself, and that I had to do these things in order to prove that
yeah,
I could do it. And it was like I was trying to prove it to myself, but
yeah,
I didn't realize I was trying to prove it to myself. So it's not that I didn't want to do them. I was still doing the same things, but my motivation shifted. And
mm,
just by the shift of that motivation, I felt so much more, I guess, kind of content with what will be, rather than
mm,
trying to almost overact it and force it and manage it. And I think it's a trap that I think a lot of us kind of work into, right? You said
yeah,
about I'm very busy because I can see the fruits of my busyness. I can see that things are happening. And you get into this belief set that actually stuff only happens because you've busied yourself and made it happen. Whereas actually, by creating the space and the framework and
yeah,
allowing stuff to happen, actually it becomes much more organic and it's less emotionally draining. And I think that was one of my biggest lessons from this whole space, where I still slip back into that mode, as we knew was never going to stop, was it? But you at least can then see there is a different way of being. Whereas before that point, it was a very one directional kind of way of working. And I think a lot of people get sucked into that, right?
I think that's true. And I think that, the other point that you made about we're always going to sort of slip back into that overworking pattern. I do too. Everybody does. That's okay. Otherwise, we've got this perfectionist ideal about this different way of working, which, that's part of the problem. We don't want to set ourselves up with another expectation. Oh my God, I've got to be chilled all the time, and like have that be a stress in our lives. So I think we always end up falling back into old patterns, particularly when under stress, under pressure. And then we can just find this way. I think that's what this sort of generative way of working allows us. We can find our way back to that creative flow state easier. One, because we've spent a bit more time there, and also because we can develop tools and practices that help to kind of reset that panic button each time we've kind of gone into that triggered mode. So I think definitely tools that help us to slow down and see. It's a self-reflection about where we are, not just what we're doing. So the focus isn't just outward on our achievements, because otherwise we're often achieving at the expense of our well-being. And I know you know this.
I learned the hard way, yes.
Yeah, and don't we all? We've got to fall off that horse a few times to
Yeah.
kind of, know how to stay on. So I think that's the thing. It's driven underneath by, and all of us have this, a sense that we don't really see our own value. And I think this is endemic in the culture that we live in, that in order to be seen and acknowledged and to know our own value, that's all coming to us from outside. So we need validation, we need acknowledgement, we need bright, shiny badges to put on our bright, shiny achievements. Otherwise, we don't know that we've done anything. And so this way of working really invites us to look at all the invisible stuff that's going on within us. And actually, the truth is, everybody has intrinsic self-value. You don't have to do anything or be anyone to own that. And I think that's a real shift for many of us. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of it, that if we can come from this sense of self-value, yes, we still want to get out into the world and achieve things. We've still got a mission to accomplish. We've still got a passion for our projects, but it's not at the expense of that kind of inner well-being. We're not driving ourselves into the ground. And as you say, there is a sort of natural flow to life. Life kind of does the work for us if we let it. And that's quite hard to believe, I think. When we're in the busyness, it's really hard to slow down at first. It's really hard to say, if I'm not efforting, I'm not going to get anywhere. And I would say to people, just experiment, just try it, have a play. This isn't life or death. You can experiment with a particular aspect of your job or a particular project, or just one day a week, 1 hour a day. Find a way. What does it feel like when you slow down and begin to allow that sort of space into your life to reflect on how you are rather than just what you're achieving? Did you experience it like that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is even just very recently as well, I came across this phrase. I can't remember for the life of me where it came from, but somebody said, don't confuse motion with progress. Just because you're
Nice.
moving doesn't mean that actually you're breaking ground or you're doing anything. And I think certainly given the COVID times as well, when you do kind of, as is always the case, overcommit and you kind of move away from that reset point,
Yeah.
and then stuff just keeps getting layered on top, and
Mm.
there's so many opportunities out there. I should be doing this and I should be doing that, and you put those expectations on
Mm.
yourself. I've now started to realize that as I get to that sort of top end of my tolerance levels, I all of a sudden, my brain wants to take that reset space. But to me, that's like almost like an inner dialogue that says, oh, I want to uh, like move my office around. I
Yeah.
want to do this because I'm still kind of seeing that sort of physical change in something, but it's not doing the things that matter. But I
Hmm.
clearly need a break. I need that
Yeah.
reset. So I'm now recognizing this urge to do something that doesn't really matter. My
Yeah.
brain is telling me I need to get back to that reset space. I've kind of gone too far to that boiling point.
Yeah.
Do definitely resonate with even now. I think having that space is almost a bit like practice space, right? It's a bit like going to the gym and training. You can go to the
Yeah.
gym for personal training and they can show you your techniques around how do you do these exercises properly. But then when you go and do your own training, habits form and you go back to doing what you were doing and you forget the nuances of how you
Mm.
should be doing it. And then it just gets further and further away from what you want ultimately it to look like. So having that reset space to say, remember, this is what it feels like, I think
Hmm.
it is a really useful, I guess, goal to have. So whether you do that for yourself, as you say, like an hour a day or a project or a person or whatever it looks, but it's reminding yourself that that's what the reset space looks like.
Yeah, and find one that works for you. There is no kind of magic button with this. It's like there are a million ways to kind of connect back in with who we really are. So find the one that works for you. Sometimes it is something quite mundane, like washing up, filling the dishwasher. There's a lot. I mean, going for a walk, I mean, that probably is the panacea for all the ills of the world. Actually, you can go for a walk at lunchtime, that cures most ills, I think. But yeah, it's finding the ways that work for you. And I mean, I've been, working with this stuff for 20 years and I still have to find those spaces for myself. And just this week, it was like I was really busy. The house was getting more and more untidy. And I kept, it's that thing of feeling like, well, I can't tidy up the house because I'm really busy at work. And then one night it was just bugging me so much. I stayed up until 11:30 and got the damn house cleaned. And the next day it was just like work flowed because I'd just given myself that space to take care of my environment. It's working from home. It bugs me when the house is untidy because every time I walk through, I'm seeing other jobs I need to do. So it can be really little nuanced nudges to help you back into that space. And I think that's something that most people don't realize about this reflective way of working, this idea of kind of working with that flow of life, if you can find it. It's not massive changes. It feels like that when we're in our kind of busy, crazy phase. It feels like I couldn't possibly do that. But even little incremental changes really add up to a big difference in attitude. And I've had so many clients say that when they have the discipline to give themselves the space, things just start to roll out from there. You
Yeah, and
know.
I think this was certainly again one of my sort of observations when I got into the flow
Mm,
of maintaining this kind of practice. That you
mm,
do kind of, as you say, sort of almost have to trust the process, for want of a better way of putting it. And then you go into those environments with a conscious mindset of, rather than manage this, I'm going to create the space. I'm going to experiment.
yeah,
And rather than saying, this is what I think, it's actually, what do you think? Or you're kind of turning the tables as such. And certainly with my youth project in particular, it was amazing that just creating the space without being really specific about how we did
mm,
that, but creating the space and saying, well, actually, what do you want to bring into that space, and let's work on your stuff, rather than I must plan, I need to know who's coming in when, and I need to know what
yeah,
we're doing, and if we don't do that, then we could do this or we could do that, and have 7 contingency plans. And it's
yeah,
just, the more I went into it, it was like it was the higher maintenance, emotionally speaking, to have all of those contingency plans under my belt to then whack it out, because I then slipped into, it's my responsibility to make sure that everything goes perfectly, and you get
yeah,
sucked into that perfectionism. So the busyness pays dividends because you see stuff, and then you get sucked into that only worked because I was really busy, and then when it worked really well, I need to make sure that it's also really perfect, and then that's my responsibility. If it's not, then
yeah.
I'm the one at fault, and it does become this kind of very quick, I guess, downward spiral with the emotional drain that it becomes on you, right?
Yeah, and I think that what I'd really like to kind of frame this bit of the conversation around is about impact. So actually, we work in a systemic way, which you've experienced with us, and that's really understanding that we are systems within systems within systems. So we have an impact on everything we touch. Our organization has an impact on everything it touches, and we're also impacted by even wider systems like society and the economy and the ecosystem. So we're actually working in a much more complex field. So if you or I go into work with this perfectionism, the impact that we're having on our team is to create a culture of overgiving, overwork, there is no permission to fail, and actually we're reducing the capacity to innovate and pivot when needed. So when stuff comes from left field, like, oh my God, coronavirus, it's like the teams that do well with that are the teams that allow themselves, they're not so rigid in their thinking, but can sort of think, okay, this has happened. What's the difficulty with this? What's the opportunity with this? Can we give ourselves the space and time to try something new? And it's not going to be perfect. That's one of the problems with perfection. It cuts off innovation. You have to give yourself permission to fail if you want to innovate. And you have to take time and space to do it. Because innovation, I mean, you can begin it on a whim, like with something like coronavirus, but you have to allow the space for that kind of messy, creative process. And I think with teams as well, I think where perfectionism shows up in teams is often pressure from above. So it's like, we've got to get this across the line now, or we've got to fix this problem now. And of course, everyone's then under pressure. They're not coming with a creative mindset. They're not bringing all of their potential, because that's the standing on your own hose. You're inhibiting your ability to do what the manager wants you to do. And so when managers come in with that perfectionist zeal, they're really contributing to that culture of overwork and overgiving. And another systemic principle is around exchange. There has to be a balance. So if somebody's overgiving, somebody's undergiving, because systems always find a balance. So what that will tend to mean is that there'll be some people on the team that really aren't finding a space to give their best, because they're being a bit flattened by somebody coming in and doing too much. So I think it shows up in individuals, but it also shows up in teams.
It's interesting, certainly, like with my kind of organization design consulting hat and such, and obviously the concept of systems thinking and design thinking obviously is even more important now than it ever used to be.
Yeah.
And I think this concept around kind of the knock on, and actually if I do this, then what are the ripples, but also if
Yeah.
I'm doing this, then where does that come from? You've got ins and outs in every system, right? I think what was really interesting, obviously after I went through my sort of journey with you as such, then going back into the organization
Mhm.
design space and actually saying, you know what, systems and organizations are nothing. Like they are a collection of people, right? And people create those systems, people and their actions, their beliefs, their behaviors, all of the things they do. And when those get put together, that's then when you have an organization. So actually an organization is purely just a collection of individuals. And how do we start to change the way an organization looks and feels, and the key ways it works is literally by starting with you, what you
Mhm.
bring to the workplace, what you create in the workplace directly and indirectly, and then working from there, right? So what, on an organizational level, on a management level, going into work, because it's such a big part of everybody's lives, right? So what kind of things might people be seeing that they're maybe doing, creating or responding to in that organizational context, if maybe that kind of generative sort of systematic approach isn't quite where it needs to be?
Well, to go back a step, when you were saying about organizations are just collections of people, I think that's true to an extent. But then actually the organization becomes an entity of its own.
Because of all of that, yeah.
So yes, it's fed into from everyone's individual standpoint. So everything that we bring to the table, all of our family history, all of our work history, all of our expectations and beliefs, the group of people bring that in, particularly the founders, but then the organization does become something else. So in our kind of, you've used the constellations tool that we work with, which is a kind of embodied mapping process. And it's really good at unearthing the invisible stuff that we can't actually see in an organization. And that's really because we're not always paying attention to that invisible layer. Same thing about individual transformation. We've got to dig down into this sort of earthy place to really see what's going on. So one of the ways that we work with teams is for people to understand what is theirs to do and what isn't theirs to do, because you can't go into a giant corporate with some completely alternative mindset and say, I'm going to change the whole organization, because the system itself will say no.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of pushback from that sort of hidden energy in the system to change programs. I mean, I forget the statistic now, but it's a really high percentage of change programs that just don't stick. Because again, you've come at that surface level and you've tried to push it to go somewhere that maybe it's just not ready or willing to go to. So if you can come down into this awareness of what's going on at an organizational level, you can find, where is it ready to evolve? I prefer the word evolve rather than change, because it's got that sort of natural flow to it. It's got a more manageable time frame to it. And it means that you can kind of see there's always sparks of change. There's always something there if you kind of begin to give yourself this, again, time and space to slow down and look and see what's going on. What are the problems that you're coming up against? But also, what's the stuff that's working well? Because one of the things we tend to do is focus on the problems. And actually, if you take a systemic perspective, you can kind of find out, well, where are the streams flowing? There's always more resource. Same with the individual. There's always more resource in the organization than they're actually using. And sometimes that might be practical resources, money, human endeavor. But sometimes it is just this, it's very hard to kind of put language to it, but there is this sort of invisible current in the organization. And you can see it where, for example, their espoused values are, one set,
Yep.
but the minute you step in there, something else is actually going on. So to begin to unearth that really involves a fair amount of courage and self-awareness to begin to name some of the things that you just sense that are going on in the organization. So it's using a different leadership capacity than we currently prize in organizational life,
Mm.
which is this capacity to tune in, trust your intuition about it, name it, just get that stuff out there into a space so you can begin to talk about it. And then you might find loads of other people are agreeing with you. You know, the problem isn't here, the problem actually is over here, but we're not talking about it, we're not making it visible.
Mm. And I guess it's that concept around kind of your sensing and believing rather than doing and acting kind of is on a different plane to a certain extent.
Yeah, and one of the things that we do is work with 4 ways of knowing. And most of us, we're in this space, we're just in our heads the whole time. We just look at our kind of cognitive understanding of what's going on. But you know, people are starting to become aware of emotional intelligence, the sort of IQ factor. But there's also our kind of intuitive understanding of what we're seeing and experiencing, and also our embodied awareness. And that, you know, we don't use that at the minute. Everyone can tune into those with a little bit of support, you know, and learning the processes. Everyone can begin to tune in to those other ways of knowing. And you may remember this from our coaching days. You know, suddenly you lay out a system on
Mm.
pieces of paper and take a walk around it, and the perspective you get brings a whole other data set of insights that you can kind of include with your cognitive understanding.
Mm. I guess within organizations now, as you say, like with the whole COVID times, like it's like the rug's just completely been pulled out from most people's feet now. If organizations are starting to say, I recognize that we need to be different
Mhm.
and operate differently and recognize now that our people need to come at who we are from a very different capacity, what kind of things can they maybe start to do, or should they maybe look out for to start to recognize that maybe there is more space for this kind of EQ and the embodied understanding within an organization to really transform the way that it feels as well as the way that it works?
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, that's a long journey. If you really want to transform the way an organization feels, that's going to take you some time and consistent, steady, incremental, you know, shifts over time. The first thing, I mean, I say it all the time, it's time and space. You have to, at the beginning, I think there is a bit of work in that just carving out the time and space. There's a bit of discipline about doing that. So whether that's, you know, once a week, there's a lunchtime session that all employees are invited to. Maybe it's facilitated, maybe it's, I mean, someone would need to facilitate it, but just a space where we're going to maybe sit together. We might even sit in silence, have a little kind of meditation together. We might just allow ourselves a space to speak and see what happens. But just anything that kind of opens a door to another way of experiencing the organization. I think that's a little kind of like acupressure point that can start to bring relief. Just give people a space to be together on an equal footing too, if possible, because all parts of the organization, from the most senior to the most junior, are experiencing how the organization feels. And most of the time we don't listen. So I think time, space, and listening are really good starting points. Also, if you can let go of expectation about, well, I'm going to do this because where I want the organization to be is over there. I mean, I've stopped agreeing to go in and facilitate teams nowadays. Like, you have an away day and people say, we want something really different. And I say, are you sure? Because I'm really different. Like, yeah, we want something really different. And then you walk in the door and they say, okay, we want you to get the team to there by the end of the day. You know, that's quite aggressive behavior, actually, to just push people. If you're going to explore this kind of evolutionary thread, you have to sit back and see, what am I noticing? What's coming towards me? What am I discovering about the organization? So it's a kind of slow burn listening practice, I think, is a really good place to start. Genuine listening, not so that we can, but
Yep.
just, what am I hearing? What are the insights that I'm building up? And the really important point around this is that you are beginning to build trust back into the system. And I'm sure you see this all the time. Most organizations are operating in a complete vacuum where there is no trust. You know, this is endemic in society as well. We can't trust our politicians. We can't trust the weather to do what it's expected to do. We can't trust that a pandemic won't we can't trust anything. We've all been failed by partners. We've all been failed by families in some ways, or friends. We stop even trusting ourselves. So we can't trust this process that life is going to reveal something to us. We've gone into that control mode to kind of manage our lack of trust in life around us. Does that resonate with you?
It does, and I guess it even happens on a conversation by conversation basis, right? You know, like you say, with the large scale organizational transformation projects, and you know, the biggest pushback you always get from most people is, but there's no point raising it because it's too difficult, or it's too hard, or it's
Yeah,
too bureaucratic, or there's too much politics, or it's been raised before and I got shut down, and all
yeah,
these sorts of things. And actually, all of those, it's too hard, kind of, whatever the
yeah,
answer is and the reason is, that's the kind of stuff that starts eroding the trust, right? So people stop trying, and then they start kind of just wandering around the organization and just surviving and
yeah.
going through the motions. And I think it was in my first couple of years of working straight out of university, we started doing some of these workshops with things like investors in people and such.
Mm.
And somebody was saying, you know, they were whinging like hell about somebody who was in their organization, and they were just a bureaucrat, and they just didn't care, and they had terrible attendance and all this, that, and the other. And the guy that I was working under at the time said, were they like that when you hired them? And of course the answer was no. And it's
Mm.
like, so what's happened? How long have they been with you? What's
Yeah.
happened? Because that isn't a natural process of decline, right? That's been
Mm.
chipped away at a number
Yeah,
of things, largely around trust and culture and such. And it is
yeah.
literally a conversation by conversation basis. It takes time, but then it also takes time to rebuild, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is where we're seeing the impact of this invisible stuff on the visible. So what you might notice is my team isn't performing so well. And the natural reaction is, well, I've got to push them to perform better. But actually, if you can drill down into the culture, into look at, what is working and what isn't working at those invisible layers, that's the thing that can really allow the team to evolve and discover again that trust. You can definitely rebuild it. I think it takes time, honesty, willingness. It takes quite a bit depending on how bad the situation is. But I've seen problems that I thought, were really intractable in an organization over time begin to turn around as you keep rebuilding that trust, keep putting that kind of groundwork in. I forgot what I was going to say. Soft lady brain. But yeah, that idea that we kind of go into the invisible, and that's what creates, I know what it was. There was once I worked with a team, and they wanted this change process. They were going through a big amount of change, and they were amalgamating 3 teams. So there was a lot of people feeling disrupted, and it was quite a large group of people. And I got them to stand in an order of how confident they were in this new plan. So that was like up one end, the people who were super confident, and right down the other end, the people who had no confidence at all. And this is quite a simple tool if you're in a sufficient place of trust to see what's going on. And we then just invited people to speak from the places where they stood. And the people that were up the confident end were quite cross with the people down at the other end, because they said, you're not getting on board with this. You're holding us
Proverbial
back.
bus. Yes, yeah, yeah.
And there was a kind of strong correlation between introverts down the less sure end and extroverts, that tend to just, no, you've got to get on board with us. You've just got to be more confident. But as you truly listen to the other end of the spectrum, where people are feeling less confident about what's going on, they're holding information that they haven't been able to put in to the kind of listening space of the system always. So it's like, embrace your mavericks, embrace the people who aren't happy and fulfilled. Listen to what they say, because the people up the more confident end are possibly barging ahead without realizing, actually, we could avoid some future difficulties if we would just listen to the people that are saying, hang on a minute, this is moving too fast and here's why. So there's something around like really including the whole. And this work is always around including the whole.
I think certainly from like senior leadership teams as well, because you say this stuff comes from somewhere. So it's absolutely recognizing the individuals and the systems across the business, but also actually those things usually get driven and created or reinforced at some level, right? I'm just thinking back to one of the large transformation projects that I worked on probably about 4 years ago, just before I started working with you. And they'd gone through this massive change project and trying to come out of a council and set up as a standalone organisation and readdress all the culture. And I think it was about 800 staff. They got tupied, but they tried it twice and it just failed. They couldn't do it. And it was interesting that when I went in and did it, I think we managed, myself and just a program manager, managed to turn it around in about 4 months. And yes, it was a busy project and there was a lot to do. But looking back at it, I think the biggest difference that I went in and did wasn't so much because I wasn't the project manager, I wasn't the program manager. I was just kind of working with the leadership team and kind of saying, well, what do you want? Rather than kind of the parent company saying this is what they want and all the sort of terms, conditions and things. That all kind of came out in the wash. And it's interesting even now seeing, look at the client testimonials, they don't talk about the actions or the project plan or the things that you did. It was what it felt like. It was actually, you know, we had confidence in what could be because we recognized maybe where we came from and what we don't want anymore, but also the opportunities that we could go into. And I just spent a lot of time with the leadership team and I guess help them sort of step into that space and make them feel like they had the opportunities ahead of them to go into and they could craft it. But it was interesting because I think a lot of people, the reason why it maybe failed in the past, as do most change projects, is because they kind of tried to programmatically like wield the life out of it just to get it over the line, and it just kept going back to what it was.
Yeah. And I think, you know, as a systemic consultant, we really respect what the system itself is saying to us through these processes. So if the system is saying no, you have to hear that no, because that systemic energy is much stronger than our individual willpower that we're trying to throw at it. You know, they are like monoliths, and the bigger the organization, you know, the bigger you know, so actually to be able to see, I mean, often I've worked with managers that they can't change the culture of the organization, but they can change the culture of their team.
Yeah.
You know, they can make their working lives and their team's working lives feel better. They can work in a more collaborative way with other teams in the organization. And maybe that's the sort of medicine that the organization needs over time that can have a ripple effect. But if you feel like, well, I'm going to go in, I mean, I often work with actual change agents and other coaches as well. And when they come in, it's like, well, I really want to change this system. And you think, well, that's not really yours to do. You've got to find your right size in relation to whatever project that you're engaged in. And I think that loops us back round to the perfectionism thing. Because if we feel like it's only by being bigger and better that we're kind of seeing our own value, we try to take on more and more and more. And I know you've experienced this in your life.
A few times, yeah.
You know, it's natural. We all do it. But it means then we're the wrong size in relation to the system. So we're giving ourselves a kind of project that's almost like it's got built in to fail, because it's just we've taken off a bigger bite of that pie than we can really manage. And there's something I want to mention about this as well, because I think all people can do this, but this idea of overgiving, overworking, it's really prevalent in women. Really prevalent in women. And I think this is something that harkens back to kind of big, long-standing societal differences between how men and women are at work. You know, we see that still to have this gender pay gap. There's direct evidence that women aren't as valued at work. And so women feel like they have to do so much more just to be seen, just to be acknowledged. And the other aspect of this, that the idea of kind of tuning into this invisible layer within the organization, women are often better at that than men. And so I've lost count of how many people I say that there's a woman at board level or senior management team, and they're sat on this kind of knowledge that they've intuitively picked up by paying attention to the whole, and they don't feel that they can voice it in those board meetings, in those senior management team meetings, where there's a lot of men driving the agenda forward.
Yeah, and the concern is that it's interpreted as soft and fluffy and therefore not relevant, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think there's a part of the reason for the burnout for women is that to give our attention to these underlying dynamics, that still takes a bit of energy from us. You know, that's a job in itself. It's hard to put a value on it because it's not valued at the moment. You know, there isn't a job title of, you know, investigator of the mystical stuff underneath the organization. You know, would that there
We
were?
should definitely make that a job, though.
Yeah, that's my job.
It's like the Harry Potter of organisations.
Exactly. Yeah.
Organisational EQ assessor. Let's.
Yeah, you know, the corporate witch or something. It's like every organization needs one. So I think women are often doing this kind of emotional labor, intuitive labor of sensing where everybody is in the organization and how everything is. But none of that is credited. So they're doing that labor, plus then having to translate that into some shiny achievement that, you know, other people can notice. So they're kind of doing two jobs.
Mm.
And there's a lot of burnout for women, you know, particularly, obviously I'm a bit older than you. You know, as you get towards the age where women hit the menopause, it's like we've mortgaged our health to be this busy, and suddenly the bank of our body forecloses on us and says, you know, I'm going to start collecting for every sleep that you missed, every extra cup of coffee you had, you know, every time you drove yourself when you really needed a rest. So there is a true cost, I think, to running things in this way.
I guess wonder as well, looking at things like kind of COVID-19 and lockdown and all these sorts of things. And I mentioned this, I think, on a previous blog, where actually, because we do all kind of creep away from maybe what we wanted, that reset point, as we mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes things happen and you think, well, as much as it's been painful for lots of different people, and you know, some even more than others, but actually for me it kind of felt like it knocked me off autopilot again. And it's like, actually, do I want what I was doing? Because I'd accumulated a lot of behaviors, expectations, obligations, even the opportunities, and I was striving to step into those opportunities. And it just gives you that time to question,
Yeah.
what am I doing? How is it impacting on the people and, you know, the other kind of the world around me as such? And then actually, how do I want to be moving forward? And even if that's small kind of practical promises to yourself, like I've said, you know, I don't want to be living out of a suitcase moving forward. And I said that years ago. I said that when I was
Yeah.
working with you, but it creeps back in
Yeah.
again, even though it feels less abrasive than it did to start with, but it still takes more of your soul away. So I guess what I'm saying is, maybe there's opportunities in everything. If we don't maybe self-identify, we need to have that reset moment. Sometimes opportunities come up whereby we should be a bit more introspective and looking at, what are we doing? How do we want to be moving forward? And I guess starting with us, with those choices of things we want to do differently.
Yeah, and it is like the power of pause. You know, you could just press the pause button, just stop for a little while and take a moment to think. And I think that's true on an individual level and on a team level. And, you know, the idea of kind of team away days used to be that you could kind of go and recharge and reconnect and just, you know, bond at a more human level. And now it's all become like, right, we're going to drive out our strategy in a day, you know. So every time we press the pause button, it's allowing us to do that kind of course correct. And it can be small if we pause often enough. And I mean, if we wait for a health crisis, if we wait for a breakdown, you know, that's a much bigger cost that we're paying, and often the organization is paying, because the amount of people that go off with stress or stress related illnesses like bad backs, and you know, that's costing organizations huge amounts of money. It would be cheaper to just say, let's all have a day off once a month and just chill, you know.
Yeah.
It really would be cheaper. And what could come out of that space could be a really creative way forward. So I think we have to be bold, actually, and disciplined in the beginning about earmarking that space. and not filling it with expectation.
Okay.
It's just empty space.
Mm. So I guess if we were going to look at some kind of practical either things to do, which feels disingenuous given what we're saying, but the
Things to not do.
yeah, like what could we change on an individual level, on a team level, and then maybe even on an organizational level? What could we do differently that could maybe help us embrace more of this kind of the embodied awareness and the systemic way of working, rather than just going through the busyness and the perfectionism and the kind of the motion means progress sort of fallacy, really?
Yeah. Well, I can give some tips, but the other aspect of this is it's really unique to you or to the team or to the organization. So, I don't come as an expert that's going to tell you what to do. What I do is say, let's listen together to what's needed here, because the person, the team, the organization, that's where the wisdom lies. Otherwise I'm just adding to that expertise. I'm going to come and tell you what to do.
Yeah.
I don't want to work in that way. What I really love to do is to help individuals, teams, organizations discover what's right for them, what's the next evolutionary step for them. But to give a kind of few general ideas is, one, you've got to have that time and space. You've got to slow down. You've got to go into a bit of reflection. And that's scary for people at first because we're so used to being driven. But try and be playful about it. So whatever that means to you, carve out a bit of space. And also, I think maybe to begin to explore the beliefs underneath the behaviors. Why are you driving yourself so hard? Or why is your sales force always failing? Whatever your belief is, just try to get under the hood a little bit with that, knowing that if you just push on the behaviors, nothing's really going to change. It's that same thing. You've got to get deep enough, change the operating system so you can run the new software. And the idea of give yourself permission to fail. Because if you're in that perfectionist route, like we said, it's an absolute barrier to innovation. So if you can find a way, maybe it's even a side project. Maybe you've got some side hustle that you want to try this out on, so that you don't even bring it into your main workplace at the start. And just experiment, have a playful space and try something different. Allow yourself to get it wrong, take up knitting and make a scarf instead of a hat. Or do you know what I mean? It's like, just get yourself out of that. It's the rigidity and the feeling of contraction. If we want to come into a flow state, it's always around expanding our sense of who we are. So you can have a good kind of barometer of whether you're being more expansive or being more contracted is, do you feel happier, more joyful, freer? Then, okay, those are good feelings to feel.
Yeah.
Or do you feel more pressured, more fearful, more restricted? And if you do, just stop. Because it's a kind of cult of overwork. It really is, because it's asking us to believe that we only get there by driving ourselves impossibly hard, and it's just not true. It's actually a barrier to really bringing our potential to light. So if you notice you're feeling pressured, fearful, restricted, that's the sign that you need to press that reset button and find something that makes you feel more expansive, just happier. You have a right to feel happy in your life. And I think people forget that. We think, no, we're just supposed to produce like we're in a machine. We're human beings, and we can be humans doing. We've got to start by being human beings.
Yeah, I guess from an organizational level, then talking to kind of senior execs and those people that maybe have the opportunity to start creating those systems, is giving people the space to do those things and recognize the importance of it.
Yes, and it can start at the top, because actually one of the things that you see in systems, if people further down the system are taking on too much responsibility and feeling burdened, it's always the case that responsibility isn't really being held higher up the system. And we've all experienced this for wherever we work, where there's just pressure comes down from above. This isn't right, you need to change it. they're not really taking responsibility for how things are working or what's going on. They're just driving that down. So that's always a clue, that if you have people lower down the system that are struggling, there's an indication that something higher up the system isn't really flowing and working healthily.
Mm. Fascinatingly different way of looking at organisations and systems, and why it's so bloody hard to change everything, isn't it, right? So what's your website, Sarah? Where can people go to find a bit more information about some of the stuff you do and the approaches that you take?
Yeah, sure. So the website is generative-work.space. So it has the word space at the end. It's an unusual URL. And if anyone wants to get in touch, you can just use hello@generative-work.space. And yeah, feel free to get in touch. I offer anyone a free 20-minute discovery call. So if this sounds like it might be interesting to you, or you have questions, or you want to know a bit more, then I'm really, really open and happy to have a conversation with people.
Awesome, and I can certainly recommend it. I feel like a new person.
Well, thank
With
you,
the same problems
Sadie.
I keep creeping back to, but at least now I can call myself out on it. So.
Yep. I mean, me too. These are human issues, aren't they? We're always going to kind of coil ourselves back into that way of doing things, but we can always uncoil ourselves out of them. That's the good stuff. So, we don't need to beat ourselves up about that.
And each time you kind of expand and contract, the new expansion is a larger expansion. So yeah,
Absolutely.
stepping into that space.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today, Sarah. You guys have been watching Sharp Shares, Sadie Sharp and Sarah James Wright of Generative Workspace, talking about all the stuff that we need to be sensing and being rather than doing, and planning our way through to achieve all those things that we maybe want to do in life and work. So thank you for watching, and I will hopefully see you again next week.